Доброго дня, шановні глядачі.
Good afternoon, dear viewers and listeners, the participants of this series of webinars, the main points in the elections of 2020. We continue our webinars, which have been organized jointly with the project of transparency, inclusiveness and fairness of elections of practices in Ukraine, with the EU in Ukraine and the platform of human rights. I'm Alexandra Burmakin. I am the executive director of the NGO, and I'm going to moderate this webinar, and we are going to discuss the topic today: who we are electing at these local elections, how the parties are going to nominate the candidates, whether it is allowed or not, and who should nominate, the issue of gender quotas, the gender of deposits, and we are going to discuss all these issues with two speakers and guests: Olga Kotyuguba, the chief advisor of Opora, and Volodymyr Venger, the docent of the chair of the General Theoretic Law and Public Law of the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. And traditionally, I would like to invite the audience to be very proactive, to ask questions, and in the comments under the stream in YouTube and also in Facebook. And we are going to ask these questions and put them to our guests, to our speakers, and we will be able to give you exhaustive answers to these questions. I would like also to remind you that the previous two webinars, which were dedicated to the general issues of the election process, the key phases, the novelties in the election code and the system of electoral commissions, who is responsible for carrying out the elections. So now, you will be able to see those and to listen to those in the YouTube channel of the Council of Europe Ukraine, and they are going to be also in the YouTube and channels of the NGOs. And I would like to suggest that we open our discussion. Mr. Vladimir, please, I would like to give the floor to you, and please tell us to which local councils are we electing, and especially the first early elections, and which are the regular elections, and people quite often cannot understand this terminology. So please tell us about this part of the electoral process. Thank you, Alexander. Well, as far as the regular elections of 2020 seems to be very easy and simple, but on the other hand, as it happens in this country quite often, a lot of impediments have been created. Some of them are natural and some of them artificial. And when we are talking about the kinds of elections, types of elections, which we are going to hold on the 25th of October this year at the level of the local self-government bodies, the problems started when we started to apply the Constitution from the very first step. So, the first slide is the starting point of our discussion, is the provision of the Constitution, Article 141, Part 3, and the essence of this article is about the principle of universality of the local elections. And this means that the regular elections, and we are going to have regular elections to the government authorities, are taking place everywhere, to all the government bodies of self-government. And it's very important to stress that this concerns also the bodies of local self-government, where the first elections have taken place quite recently, a little bit more than 12 months ago, like 6 months ago, 12 months ago, it doesn't matter. But nevertheless, the elections have to be carried out now too. At the end of December last year, the first elections to the amalgamated communities took place. And actually, some councillors and some heads of the communities have been in power for less than 12 years, but the constitutional principle of universality requires them to carry out the regular elections and to be re-elected and to get the representative mandate for the next 5 years. But, as I mentioned, in Ukrainian real life, the Ukrainian parliament has created the problems, and there were objective and subjective problems, political ones, subjective ones. Maybe we should not discuss them here among the legal experts. But as far as the objective reasons, I'd like to tell you the following. Well, we can look at them through the lens of the administrative territorial reform which has started, and also the reform of decentralization, reform of the system of the self-government bodies. And not very timely implementation of these reforms, to put it mildly, but quite late reforms created the situation that not only the regular elections are taking place at present in Ukraine, and here you can see at this slide the main documents which define the kinds of election which are going to take place in Ukraine. The first document is the resolution of the Parliament of setting up the elections. Should the Parliament take into account Article 141 of the Constitution, we could confine ourselves to this first document, the regular elections which are carried out in accordance with the regular procedure. But when this resolution was passed, and during discussing various versions of this regulation, several options were offered, and one of them was not to appoint the regular elections to all the local government bodies, but to appoint the elections to some of them. And the resolution, as a result of the discussion in Parliament, the regular elections were appointed to all the self-government bodies, but they made a couple of exceptions. Yes, there was a discussion and even a scandal. Not all kinds of elections were covered by this first resolution. Yes, there is item number 1 in this resolution, and traditionally the Parliament was formulating it in general terms to appoint the regular local elections. Sometimes they were enumerating the kinds of election, but it was always general one. In the first draft of this resolution, there was the wording about appointing the regular elections only for Oblast Council and Kiev City and Kiev Mayor, and it didn't cover the Rayon councils and the councils of the communities, and also the elections of the village and village councils and towns council and the mayors of thereof. The logic was very simple. The Parliament, taking into account that administrative territorial reform is underway and also a process of amalgamation, considered that new communities are going to be set up and the first elections have to be appointed, and they are, in accordance with the electoral code, are appointed by the Central Electoral Commission. But during the discussion, the Parliament was persuaded, and the Standing Committee amended the draft resolution and appointed all the local elections. And there were several exceptions. The first one, the elections in the territory which is not under control of Ukrainian government, that is the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, and also the elections to the Oblast Council of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. And also, additionally, it was emphasized that the Central Electoral Commission has an authority not to appoint the elections at certain territories where the elections cannot take place due to the reasons of security. Those are the areas which are close to the area of military conflict. So after the resolution of the Parliament, we've got 3 other resolutions of the CEC. The first one was of August this year, and this is about the first elections of the deputies of village, towns and city councils and the mayors of thereof. And here we have obtained quite an interesting situation. The Central Electoral Commission appointed the first elections to all the communities, including those whose borders have not been changed, those which have been set up recently, and those which continue to operate. We are not going to discuss the logic and motivation and appropriate argumentation of the CEC, but this is a fact of life. So at the first level of local self-government, we are going to have first elections. There was another interesting story, that is the appointment of the elections of the councillors of the Rayon councils. In the process of decentralization, a special commission under the President of Ukraine is working, and the working group and a number of working groups which are developing the amendments to the Constitution of Ukraine. And they're discussing one of the ideas, which is about cancelling the Rayon councils. Some of the experts wanted to advance this process and prior to amending the Constitution not to appoint the elections to the Rayon councils. From the point of view of constitutional law, it is absolutely impossible and unacceptable, and the elections to the Rayon Council should have been appointed together simultaneously with the first election, but the delay took place. Why first elections? I hope that everybody who is watching us understands why the parliament passed a resolution about administrative territorial arrangement, decreased the number of rayons. There were more than 400, now there are 134, just a little bit over 100. So and new rayon councils are going to be created, and the first new elections are going to be carried out. After the first discussions with the Standing Committee, the CEC on the 14th of August appointed the first elections to the rayon councils, and the decision was taken about the impossibility to carry out the first elections to certain communities in the territory which is under control of the Ukrainian government within the Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast. Now I'm going to summarize everything I've said. The regular elections to Oblast councils and to Kiev City Council, and also the election of Kiev Mayor, the first elections to the Rayon Councils, and to the first level of the local self-government, the councils and the mayors at the level of the village, settlement and city. The elections are not carried out in the area which is outside control of the Ukrainian government, and at certain communities in the area which are located in the areas under control of Ukrainian government. You were talking about the principle of the universality, Vladimir. And as far as I understand, the essence of this principle is that the elections have to take place all over the territory and all the levels. And this area, which is under control of the Ukrainian government along the border with the Lugansk and Donetsk Oblast, was discussed a lot. In 2015 and in 2019, the elections were carried out in some of the communities in this area. But now these areas have been excluded from the list of communities where the elections have to be taken place. And what's the logic? There is a political component and a legal component here. I would like to discuss the legal component. From the point of view of legal component, we can talk about the areas which are under control of Ukrainian government, and we are not discussing those which are outside control of Ukrainian government. What are those territories which are under control of Ukrainian government? Formally, these elections automatically should have been appointed with the other regular elections, but the impossibility to carry out those elections have to be verified by the CEC. The procedure is envisaged by the Electoral Code and some other regulations, and this procedure have been carried out. In this procedure, certain aspects actually aroused a lot of discussions. The experts believe that the civil military administrations who have made the submission should not have been doing it because there is a conflict of interest, they say, or the problems of objective evaluation of the situation there by the military administrations. The military civil administrations, these are the government authorities which are substituting the bodies of local government and self-government in the areas where the local self-government cannot be carried out in the normal mode regime. And the situation is created when the military civil administrations have to tell and to take the authority to themselves. In terms of budget, resources, and things things like that. And a lot of experts believe that this is a conflict of interest, and this procedure should be adjusted. Maybe the military-civil administrations have to be kept there, but some other objective factors are to be added, which give an opportunity to take the decision that the elections should not be carried out there. And this is not only about the security component. What do you mean by security? It depends. If we just understand it in a narrow sense, whether there is military action or not, shoot or not shoot, this is not only the security, but the security in the wider sense. It's the possibility for political parties to operate, the freedom of expression of ideas, associations, and safety of the documents, and in the wide sense, this is the security. But this discussion ended when the CEC issued a decision. And unfortunately, we cannot adjust it now because the electoral process could not be stopped. It could be just suspended, but and to start the new electoral process for these territories is impossible to catch up with 25th of October because a lot of actions should have been taken place earlier. And the elections are not going to take place on the 25th of October, and they could be carried out only after addressing certain issues which are required by the Electoral Code. And this is a political question to a great extent, because we have in these areas which are under control of Ukrainian government some paradoxical situation. In some places, up to the present, the local government authorities still have the powers which have been elected in 2010, because when the military civil administration is substituting the local self-government authority, is not being dissolved. It remains, and it does not carry out their powers. If we are talking about Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast Council, these military civil administrations have substituted them with the beginning of the occupation after the relevant law was passed on the military civil administrations, and they are not functioning. So the problem is there. It has to be addressed in the legal way, but this is a very delicate issue and sensitive issue, and a number of factors have to be taken into account, not only the security factors, but most probably this issue is not going to be addressed in the nearest future. And if we are talking about the kinds of election, well, if I would like to characterize them briefly and tell you what's going to happen in the elections, I would emphasize the following. Oblast councils, that is proportional system, and these are regular elections. Olga is going to talk about it in more detail today, but I'm going to tell you about the most important issues. Proportional system at the regular elections. Proportional system is going to be used for the election of the council in Kiev, but majoritarian system with the absolute majority is going to be applied for electing the mayor of Kiev. Rayon councils and city councils and village councils are going to be carried out on the basis of the proportional system, well, where the number of electors, population is 10,000 elections, 10,000 people in the large communities, yeah? And there, the first elections are going to be carried out. There was a discussion about the early elections in certain communities, but it was not positively resolved prior to the beginning of the electoral process. And
може стати кандидатом.
If you move over to the next set of questions, who can be a candidate? Here we can talk about the following things. On the one hand, there are very simple requirements that are provided for by the Electoral Code. On the other hand, there is a set of indirect restrictions, safeguards, or even direct prohibitions. I'm going to outline them later, that are additional requirements to the candidates, potential candidates. The Electoral Code establishes the main requirement, namely to run for the candidates of the leader could be given only to the citizens of Ukraine. That's under Article 70 of the Constitution. The person should be of age, 18, and should be legally capable. So that means a lack of any court ruling as to the criminal record. If this decision is there, but it didn't come into effect, the person can run. Similarly, the persons that can run are those that have a specific document testifying that. Another thing is the law abidance criteria. So that means that the person, a citizen of Ukraine who has criminal record for committing any offense, serious, minor, or medium-sized, medium gravity offense, cannot be nominated. So, since the moment the person started serving the sentence, that means that there is a court decision that came into effect until the time the person is serving the sentence. So the criminal record could be removed, or could be removed by law, and it looks that the requirements could be expunged. But, well, the question here is how they can exercise this voting right. So, on the other hand, we can look at the question like if the person should be physically residing in the community to be entitled to run. So that's desirable for local government to be able to resolve the issues of local importance. The person should be aware of these issues, and should be the person should be part of the community. And that means that the electoral code, if we look at that, there are no additional requirements. Talking about local elections, so the person from other community can claim and run. So, well, it could be the person from a different region. Whether it is good or bad, well, it's hard to say. The Constitution does not impose any additional restrictions in this regard, but the lawmaker here relies more on the informed choice of the voters. So, for instance, people from Kherson, as you said, they were not supposed to vote and support the candidate from Uzhhorod or any other town. But if they do believe that that's the person who is reliable, then they can do that. We have the opposite examples, and successful parachute type of projects, as we call them. Well, if I remember right, let me refer to the example that you know well. So this requirement of being part of the community should be there when you talk about the membership in the electoral commissions. So if it is TEC, then you have to be registered. So in the latest electoral code, it was slightly changed. Previously, we had this requirement, and it was linked to the passive voting right. As it was explained then, and it was the difference between the requirements, it was a simple explanation. So for the person to be able to exercise a representative mandate, you can do it later. But when it comes to TEC, that's the work that should be done now. So that was a very simple explanation. From my personal experience, it's not an issue. If the voter makes an informed choice, then it's going to resolve all the issues. And it's not necessary to resort to some dramatic examples when people come from a different region to run in this particular constituency. We have people residing in satellites. For instance, in the suburbs of Kiev, we have lots of villages and towns with large residential districts. And people just live there, but they commute to Kiev to work, so they are more keen on proper infrastructure being developed in Kiev rather than in the place where they live. So that's agglomeration. Okay, the next requirement, that's criminal conviction, and while effective decision of the court is of importance. What are the levels that allow for self-nomination? So partisan affiliation, that was the subject matter of the discussion. Sometimes it dominates or sometimes it is very low. Well, it depends on the size of the community. And due to particization, the chance for self-nomination decreased. Well, it's not the subject matter for this discussion, but we have to mention the other side of this story. Following administrative territorial reform and the creation of new rayons, we see cities with rayon delineation where we can see a lot of small villages and towns, and it's hard to say whether they are independent now or they are part of this city. An interesting story with cities. The cities with oblast status are part of rayons, even larger ones like Kharkiv, Lviv, Odessa. They are not independent anymore, so they are not subordinate to the oblast level. They are part of respective rayons. So, in other words, Kharkiv is the city of Kharkiv as part of Kharkiv rayon. And the next question, whether self-nomination is allowed and how it is done, then the question here is, are the parties ready? Have they reformatted their local organizations to run under new format? Since city being part of rayon means that rayon organization of this particular party should exercise statutory powers with respect to the city one. When it comes to villages and towns that are part of new communities, the situation there is interesting. The lawmaker makes partization or party affiliation more important at the oblast level, because there we can see the only level where you can find party affiliations. But if self-government is mainly for the lowest level, then why self-nomination is allowed for the oblast level? Unfortunately, it's not taken into account by lawmaker. Self-nomination is allowed at all levels. It's allowed at the lowest level, at the level of councils with the communities of 10,000. We'll speak about it later. Here, I just mentioned this as additional obstacle, additional requirement, because running in the constituencies under majoritarian system, there we can see both self-nomination and nomination by the parties. And if it is rayon council, rayon within city and large communities, so that's only party that can nominate. So despite electoral code, despite constitution and the criteria there, the indirect criteria make candidates stick to being nominated by parties only, and that's an addition requirement. Another set of questions that are linked to the mandatory party affiliation. The legislation does not impose this requirement. It could be either the member of the party or the non-affiliated person that can be nominated. At the same time, the combination for different types of elections of the types of nomination is impossible. If the candidate wants to run as a self-nominee for the leader of the city, so he cannot be nominated at the same time by the party to run for the oblast council. So even if it is a small village community, then this person should run from this particular party. And that's another indirect restriction that limits the electoral laws and possibilities. 3971 bill, well, we mentioned this law at the previous webinars, so we are not going to discuss this draft law, but this draft law was not voted into the law, and that's a serious issue that is behind it, because it was not the issue of party affiliation that was supposed to be resolved by it, but there were other things that were to do with the electoral process that the bill was to address. Self-nomination and party nomination, can it be equal in terms of the values? No, I don't think so, can the party refuse to nominate the person based on the documents submitted by the candidate? Could it happen when the agreement was accomplished before? So that's another side of the party affiliation element of local elections. If you talk about so-called partization, that's party affiliation, then that could lead to full discreditation of the parties. When the party at its meeting made the decision to nominate a person, the documents could be submitted, they may not be submitted. So another interesting thing here, electoral code require approval from central authority, from Kiev. And that's the first time ever when we see this happening. We had this at local elections of 2015. When I learned about this procedure, I couldn't figure out why we would need this control of the central party organization over the lower levels, over the regional level. What's the point of having this? Why would you have this control? Who is nominated at the lower level? From legal point of view, that's absurdity. But he said that we had this before. Indeed. There was one faction who proposed this, and that was caused by the situation that at the elections of 2010, some party organizations of lower level were raided. So the person who was re-elected by the party Congress, but this person was on the register representing others. So, for instance, in Lviv Council, there were two lists of the nominees, and it was necessary to establish which list was to be validated, who signed the list, and whether this list was signed by the leader. And that was the reason to institute this initiative, and the faction insists on the list being approved, and it was part of legislation all the time. We had the same in 2015. So Central Party Organization, in fact, approves the validity of the list that was approved by the regional party organization. Yes. And we need to see it broadly, because along with the innovation of this type, and their incorporation into electoral code, we saw the amendments made to the law on the status of the councils, and their mandate of 2015 was made even tighter. Imperative mandate of 2015 was recalled in the council, and it was to be done at least provided there is some kind of a formal initiative of respective constituencies. So following these amendments, the party can initiate recalling or withdrawal of the person. And then the picture looks like that. Not all the parties are convinced that they control their local organizations, and they try to resort to some artificial methods to replace for this. Is it good or bad? It is apparently bad, because if you count bad conduct at the local level, then you should do that by raising your members, the members of your party properly, as it happens in other countries, or you can bring them to account. Otherwise, it looks like authoritarian kind of type of ruling. Very tight type of party control that we see here, rather than self-governing organization with its local parties, etc. You said that in 2015 we had some signs of imperative mandate in legislation. Within this period of time until 2020, did we see some examples of recalling, and how effective was the mechanism, and what are the numbers? I'm not ready to give you any statistics. We did have a lot of examples, though, and they were not the cases that we saw immediately after elections, but even recently in spring this year, we saw some instances of recalling. It was the scandal of Kyiv City Council that was widely covered by media. The mandate of large number of factions were recalled. Basically, when it comes to the city council, half of the mandates of one party were recalled, and new councillors were elected. They were sworn, and the commission, electoral commission, made a special resolution because there were some, disputes as to who was actually the winner, because it turned out that some people were different. But when it comes to party affiliation, we need to look at it from different perspective. So that's the tool to encourage development of local party organizations and political life at the local level. But here we need to know that in the civilized world, the party work at the local level is really limited. And even when we see some of it, so it's focused to the fight of ideas rather than messages. A lot of candidates promise to increase pensions and resolve some issues of national scale, like Euro integration or some other things, or tariffs. But it's not for the local level to deal with that. Unfortunately, when it comes to local party organizations, they never speak about ideological issues. When I talk to my students, I give very good example. So if it is a right-wing party or liberal party, then they should offer liberal approach, for instance, to disposal for trash. And socialist party should offer its socialist approach, for instance, to dispose of trash and fund it from the budget. But Liberal Party should offer a contest, tender of 3 or 5 companies, pick up the one that would be the best, not to have higher prices. Unfortunately, not a single party manifesto has anything like that. But the electoral code does not require that. Unfortunately, party manifestos are mandatory, only necessary for proportionate part of the list. And that's limited to 4,000 of characters, and that's an issue. So this party affiliation with the proportionate system is going to have a serious impact. Another issue is the following.
That is the right to be nominated. At the first glance today, there are quite understandable norms of the electoral code as far as the parallel running are being doubted by the CEC. The electoral code says that the candidates are being limited by 2 levels of the local councils to run for both. And I've heard a very interesting interpretation of this norm today. The word could, it means that he or she is not obligated. So the person could be nominated for 2 levels of council, but if they want very much, they can be nominated for 3 levels. It doesn't mean that they are limited to 2 levels. But, that's a very interesting interpretation. But nevertheless, it has a right of life, to life. And there is a more practical question. What are the levels of the local councils? Is it constitutional division of oblast, rayon, and city and village, or any other levels if we take into account the proportional electoral system with the preferences for oblasts and rayons and big cities? And similarly, another aspect is important. This is the limiting number of candidates to the position of the mayors. And the story here is even more complicated because the legislator, used the inappropriate terminology, and they used the terminology which does not correlate with the electoral system. And when we are talking about nomination, at the slide, you can see the simplified system and just a very simple, interpretation of these limitations. So the Electoral Code says that there are some limitations in running for multi-mandate constituencies, but in the proportional system, they are using just one multi-mandate constituency. But here we are talking about this draft law which was not supported due to a political issue. The version which could resolve this problem in the draft law of 3947 could have created twice as many problems as we have now. This problem, as for me, could be easily resolved by the interpretation of the CEC. And they actually promised us to give this interpretation at the previous webinar. Today they are going to have a meeting, and there is a draft, a resolution to this effect. I don't know what this draft is. It's a secret up to the present, but we hope that the CEC is going to interpret it similarly to what you can see on this slide, or maybe even in a more liberal way. Why it is very important? Because the parallel running actually is an imminent opportunity to realize the passive electoral right. That means that a person can run for several levels and participate in several campaigns and then decide whether it is ethical as far as the electors are concerned. We can discuss it, because there were cases in Ukraine when at the local elections the mayors of the big cities won, and then they refused their mandates and preferred to be elected to the parliament. And that's the question of the ethics. But Constitution guarantees an opportunity to implement the passive electoral law. And these limitations are very doubtful from the point of view of being constitutional. And they have in mind only one simple task: to save money. As far as I've heard, the parties have the practical need in parallel nomination or running, because they simply don't have enough sufficient number of candidates. That's a different question, and that's a very serious problem. Even at the low level, sub-level, at the level of settlements and small villages, they even offer fees to include a candidate into the list, so that formally to adhere to the requirements of the electoral code. Not only male candidates are lacking, but female candidates are lacking, and this is a big problem for certain political parties. And in some of the political parties, it's a very acute problem, the lack of female candidates. There is another problem which is related to the parallel nomination. The main idea was to save money, funds, because an individual who is running for the majoritarian constituency, the village, town, or big city up to 10,000, or is running for the mayor, and if he or she is choosing between the mayor and the councillor of this council, then it will be necessary to again carry out elections of the mayor. So to use these funds, they doubt the constitutional principle of equality and the freedom to implement the electoral law. I think that this is non-proportional limitation, and it's not correct. But by saving the money, the parliament did not finish, so to say, this idea. If we look at the selection of the mandate after the election, have not been spelled out properly. Even an individual is going to run in parallel, and will get a mandate at both elections. The law does not envisage what this person should do, how this person should decide which mandate he or she is going to select and that which procedure is going to be used to resolve these issues. But unfortunately, this has not been resolved. Could it happen that the person can become the deputy of the bodies of two levels? Theoretically, it can happen, and this is expected at the proportional electoral system. As an individual is running proactively, working, and the territorial constituencies are overlapping. For example, in the city of Zhytomyr, for the mayor and the Oblast Council and the city council. And if the Oblast Council will be projected over the city council and the very reputable local politician is going to run, they will collect enough votes to both councils, and he or she will get one mandate, but it will be a good bonus for his team. And actually, he will give an opportunity to the members of his party to occupy the seat in the council. And the fact that the person can win, it's quite understandable. But let's go back to what Vladimir said about the ambiguity of certain issues. What should be done when the person wins both levels of the election, whether they can take an oath? No, only one representative mandate could be implemented. And there are several categories in the public service, not the civil service, but public service, where the individual cannot be employed if he or she has a representative mandate, but they can run. They can run, but they cannot get this mandate. That's why it will be necessary to refuse from one of them. But they will get one mandate, at least. And then he or she will not be able to get the second mandate. It's a question of registration of the deputies. But the person could be elected twice. Or if we are talking about the possibility for the village mayor to run in the cities for up to 75,000 people, they might take several mandates. There is another limitation or restriction. This is the restrictions in operation of the political parties, and this is the component I mentioned already. The local branch of the party has to be registered according to the law, and I've mentioned it at the beginning. After the administrative territorial arrangement, the majority of political parties, and there were 190, which actually applied to the CEC and thus to participate in the elections, but I am afraid that the majority was not able to re-register their branches in the local areas, and actually they have to be registered as a political party. And the local branches are very important, which are built as a pyramid, the statutory bodies, the members of the branches. And for example, if the party is not re-registered at the level of the new rayon, for example in Bila Tserkva, and a new rayon has been created in Bila Tserkva, and it amalgamated a lot of other areas into it. And if in Bila Tserkva the local branch of the party A has not been registered in accordance to the new administrative division without carrying out a conference or the statutory meeting taking into account new territorial arrangement, but to nominate the candidate from the old branch, it will make this situation legitimate. But I know there was some interpretation, but this was about forming the commissions. No, I mean the rayon branch organization of the party, which has been registered, and it was operating within the old borders of the old rayons, but now the new rayons have been created. So what should they do with that old rayon organization? Should it be registered? Yes, it should be registered, because the CEC faced this problem, and Olga mentioned it. They have formed territorial electoral commissions. So which organizations have to make submissions? And the CEC faced a problem, because several days have elapsed since the resolution of the parliament has been passed about the creation of the new rayons, and CEC had to maneuver, to acknowledge some of them, to not acknowledge others, and they asked for interpretation of the Ministry of Justice. Well, that was the only way out. But more than a month elapsed since then, almost 2 months elapsed since that time, but nothing has been done in the country because these issues have not been addressed institutionally, and the parliament is not even trying to resolve them at the legislative level. And there are no steps taken in this direction. Some parties are being very proactively registering their branches, whether they will be able to do it prior to the elections. I remember in the Facebook when the register has been halted and stopped. The register of the legal entities was not working for a long period of time. Vladimir, there is another interesting aspect as far as the pyramids and the hierarchy of the party organizations is concerned. It could start from the bottom and up to the central, to the top, to the central branch of the party. But again, the application. If there is no lower level of organization, does it mean that the organization won't be able to participate in the elections, or can they do it at the level of the oblast organizations? Where the oblast organization of the party can nominate all the candidates for all the levels, for elections of all the levels. It's both good and bad simultaneously. They can do it, and it's good and bad. On the one hand, under the situation and conditions which have been created, it's a lifesaver for the parties to participate in the elections. But on the other hand, on the flip side of it, well, we have to develop this self-government at the lowest level, and it will be impossible to do if the oblast organizations substitute the lowest one. But the lowest organizations, not everything is that simple, because most of the political parties have been creating their oblast organizations without the status of the legal entity. They do not have accounts with the banks, and the deposits cannot be paid, and some commissions committed that the party itself is considered to be on the top of the hierarchical ladder, and then they can make a deposit. But I believe that the central governing organizations of the party cannot be considered, local organizations. They are hierarchically superseding, but they are not actually substituting the local organizations. Also, there are the problems of decommunizations. There are difficulties. CEC is going to try to give additional interpretations, and they have already developed certain draft documents to this effect. And the last, but the most important, that the local organization of the party has to have the appropriate authority to nominate, because in spite of the authoritarian scheme of nomination, which is spelled out in the election code, there are some statutes or charters of the political parties where they do not allow the minimum democracy when the local organizations carry out their meetings only on the permission of the top-level organizations. And I would like to suggest that you have to look the latest option of the statute. Maybe it has been amended, and try to understand whether you will be able to be nominated if the statutes of the party envisage such a procedure. Maybe the last question, going back to the authoritarian manner of governing under the dictatorship. I read the election code, and there is Article 213. But as far as the oblast organizations can nominate at all the levels, and there is a very interesting solution. And legislator believe that there will be competition. Well, please confirm whether I am right or not. If the city organization is nominating its own list and the oblast organization nominates other people, so the priority is to the oblast organization to nominate for the city council. And this is one of the elements of hierarchization, subordination within the vertical of the statutory bodies of any party. And you're absolutely correct. If two packages of documents are being submitted, so the top-level organization has a priority. Whether it's good or not, I don't know, from the point of view of party managers and the parties which would like to preserve the control, whether the internal party democracy is not working. Maybe for them it's a way out, it's good for them, but from the point of view of development of the country, of the democratic procedures of the local self-government, it's not good. It's even, harmful, because people thus are not responsible for their decisions. And this is not only about the party members, but also the voters, the electors. So these are the main theses which are related to the question which sort of elections we are going to have, and who can run for these elections, and who can be candidates during these elections. Yeah, it was very interesting. Hope that our listeners and viewers also are interested in these topics. Let us start the next presentation. Olga is going to start now. We are not going to repeat certain items which have been already addressed. It was mentioned already who has a right to be elected, and I have to emphasize here, we are talking about nomination, and we talked already about nomination, and also the Commission can refuse to register the nominee or cancel the registration, and it can be done on the basis of the application of the party who has nominated the candidate, and 19 days prior to the elections, they have a right to revoke this candidate, or an individual can refuse from running, or the party can fail to submit the package of documents, which was mentioned by us as well. But the grounds for refusing a registration or cancelling registration is failure to confirm of these requirements which we've mentioned. If it will be found out that an individual is incapacitated, or the individual... Yeah, Olga, that's an interesting topic. You have practical experience in this area. The individual who is incapacitated, how is it possible to check this? Because this is a private information. It's a super private information. Me, as an expert on the access to public information, I can tell you that this is a super private information, and the access to it is absolutely limited. How the Territorial Commission can check whether the person is incapacitated or not? And this is a big enigma. On the one hand, the code gives the Commission, the CEC, the right to cancel registration if they've got this information, but where they can get this information and how, it is absolutely understandable. Whether, some opponents might heard about some things and they report on it, but the question is how to verify this information within a short period of time, because the TEC cannot be governed by certain decision or a copy of the decision which was brought by the opponent. If it is not being confirmed, it's the grounds for litigation. And if we are analyzing the register, there are a lot of cases like that. When the TEC receives a certain document application, TEC passes a resolution on refusing the registration or cancelling the registration, and then at the end of the day, it is necessary to submit the ballots to the DEC, but they start litigations. And
naturally, if the only answer is that TEC sent the request and received the response to it, though when we look at the refusals or rejections that we saw at the previous elections, I heard that CEC had some issues with that. Well, indeed. So the State Migration Service had some information about crossing the border, but this information cannot serve as the proved evidence that the person committed some kind of offense or that's a violation. So if the candidate disputes something and goes to court, we can say that the court rejects it, the question. So, limited capacity. Have you ever had any candidates with this? I've never heard about any candidates with limited capacity. At the previous elections, we had an issue when the candidates failed to submit asset declarations. Sometimes they didn't submit any or misstated. There could be some issue with the certificate about, well, so what about asset declarations, limited capacity? In civil law, we draw a line between limited capacity and lack of legal capacity. If that's the person with mental health issues and there is a certificate to prove that, the person is entitled to vote until there is a court ruling that came into effect, and it can come into effect following registration of the person. So the ruling could be delivered, but did not come into effect yet. So that's a very complex issue. The same with criminal record. The court ruling could be there, but it didn't come into effect yet, and that could have a serious legal implication. So that could serve either as the ground for revocation or rejection. But the most important thing here is how TEC can get reliable, accurate information on that. Fully agree with Volodymyr that limited capacity and a lack of legal capacity, these are different things. No. We are talking about lack of legal capacity and finding the person incapacitated. Nomination of the candidates starts September 15 and lasts until September 24, and TECs until 29th of September do have some time. That's 5 days since the moment the candidate or the party or organization nominated the person and submitted all the documents. So they have 5 days to consider that. The deadline is September 24, and there are 5 days until September 29 to make a decision. Next week we are going to talk about campaigning, and electoral code imposes severe restrictions, and I don't think anybody would be rushing to start registration immediately on September 15. Well, we'll see how it's going to happen depending on the country. If you look at the list of the documents required for registration, we see some inequality here. For instance, the criminal record certification and a statement about alimony. If you kept an eye on all the amendments that were suggested to electoral code, so it was supposed to be part of the entire list of documents. But at a later stage, when Kalchenko submitted its amendments and added more requirements, these documents were removed from mandatory, and as a result of final voting, we see that it is only one level of councils based on one system. We need to submit a document on alimony. If you talk about criminal record certificate, there are explanations of the CSC, and there is some kind of understanding what kind of document it is. What about this document about alimony? What kind of a certificate is it? What kind of document is it? So it's not a certificate really. So there is no authority that would issue this type of a document. So basically, that's a personal statement. So the person writes basically, I'm a good person and I don't have any debt when it comes to alimony. That's my interpretation of the provision, because there is no designated authority that would issue this document. There is a serious problem about this, because the statement about absence or lack of debt on alimony appeared recently, and it's everywhere, and it serves everywhere on the list of different documents. There is a different story why we have it. But when it comes to electoral legislation, lack of any debts on alimony is important. So in other words, if the person pays alimony and there are no debts, there are no arrears there is no issue. Because sometimes we can hear, okay, so since you pay alimony, you cannot run. No, that's not the story. When it's alimony, that's the child care money. Any other payments, whether that's to do with the senior parents or spouses after divorce, and there is a court ruling on that. So it's not covered by this provision. You can verify that only if there is some kind of proceedings, and there are some arrears for the period of 6 months, and the case is in court. So the candidates that feel that this could be an issue, I would advise to go to the respective authority, to the state service that could issue some kind of a document. Those people who pay alimony, they know the bailiffs that can do that. But for most of the people, this shouldn't be an issue. That's just a statement that the person is making, and the law does not provide any liability if the person misstates in this statement. So it's not the ground for rejection. So if the person misstates in the statement, then the person shouldn't face any liability. So again, the question here is with the number of the candidates, how the TSE is capable of verifying that. So it's only the state bailiff service that could have it. So the TSE cannot verify virtually every statement that they are going to receive. So then, well, ideally, TSE should have the right to verify it somehow. Well, I think we need to remove it, because this statement has nothing to do with nomination, shouldn't have any impact on that. What about the moral qualities? We spoke about moral qualities. So the person failed to pay alimony for 3 years and is running for the position of a councillor at the oblast level. At the previous elections, we had this as a requirement. This statement, this kind of document is more for general awareness. So that would serve for or against the respective candidate and should have an influence at exercising the voting right of the voters in terms of their choice, but it doesn't have any legal effects, even if the person is lying. So if there are no legal effects, what's the point of having it? So that's why the draft law that we keep referring to, there was a suggestion to remove it. Speaking about other document, that's criminal record certificate, there is a problem there. Our observers tried to experiment, and well, though it was on September 4, it was online request that we submitted to get a criminal record certificate, or rather absence of criminal record certificate. There is no response yet, apart from being notified that the request was accepted and is being processed. We haven't received any results. We spoke about that. A lot of people started making money on that, actually. Indeed. And everything is basically about the following. Everybody who wants to get registered without any issues would look for some kind of mediating companies, and well, they're trying to figure out how much would it cost to get this certificate. I heard about 150 and 20. Okay, the person is running to 2 councils, so that's another expenditures that are added to the list of the costs the candidate is going to face. So the persons who go to mediators can get this absence of criminal record certificate without any issues. That's another corruption risk that is there, and I think that an ACP should sort of take that into account. But unfortunately, the legal provision is there. We were talking about the manifestos. Well, these are the luckiest, the proportionate system. And I think we'll see most of the candidates here. In each constituency we need to nominate at least 5 candidates. So this number, just due to the electoral code requirements, will be the highest. We discussed that, and we'll skip this. In fact, despite having 2 lines here where self-nomination is allowed, if you look at it from the geographic point of view and given the electoral systems, we understand that most of the communities are not going to have self-nominees because these candidates are not entitled to do that, and we spoke about the deficiencies. We mentioned that it was the violation of the Copenhagen criteria. Minister of Foreign Affairs referred to Copenhagen criteria recently, given the security issues at the upcoming elections in the areas close to the front line. We spoke about this in detail, this provision as to the simultaneous nomination and the use of the term of multi-mandate constituencies. While previously we used to have this term multi-mandate constituency almost all the time, and we saw a lot of amendments that are made now in July 2020. They have been developed based on the proposals of the CC, where multi-mandate constituencies were replaced with territorial constituencies, not to confuse, but simultaneous nomination was submitted by a different group. That was a kind of, political decision, and they came up with the definition that we had with the previous version of the law. That's why we have this situation that require explanation of the CEC, and we very much hope that the explanation will be the one that Volodymyr offered in his comments. As to general requirements to be nominated, the procedure of nomination by the political party should be approved by the party decision. To participate at the local elections, the copy is submitted to the CC, and yesterday we saw the list of political parties published. 194 political parties are going to run. CC and others in the newsletters stress that not all 194 parties are going to be de facto subjects of the electoral process, because the party could state that they would run, but then at a later stage they may change their mind and may not nominate any candidates, and some of the parties notify about their desire to participate in the elections, because that's part of the requirements for the party activity. They should participate in the elections. At the previous webinar, we had a representative of the CEC who spoke about the reasons for a large number of those who desire to participate in the elections. And one of the reasons for that is the party should show that they are active during the elections, not to be sanctioned by the Ministry of Justice, and not to have their registration registration revoked. Once in 10 years, that's looked into. The second is technological elements to do with the commissions, the possibility of set up the PECs, quotas, etc. And there was another reason for activity. I can't remember now what it was exactly that he mentioned, but anyways, there are some reasons for this active participation in the elections. Well, that make parties nominate, at least nominate one person. On this list, we have the Communist Party. It made the decision to participate in the local elections through its local party organizations, but as we said, in fact, this party does not comply with the requirements of the communization law. And if you look at the information available on the CC website, the CC immediately made a footnote for the TCs stating reference to the order of the Ministry of Justice that the Communist Party does not comply with the criteria. That's an interesting story with the Communist Party. It should be banned. Allegedly it is banned, but it has not been liquidated yet. To my knowledge, the decision on banning political party is missing. So that's a kind of quasi situation when there is no decision to ban it, but there is an additional criterion that was included to participate in the elections. The party is to, and that means the symbols, the program and the title, the name of the party should comply with the decommunization law. And this party doesn't comply with that. That's why they can't participate in the elections, though they are willing a lot to do that. That's one of their kind of policy. They submit a request to be allowed to participate. They got refusal. They contest that. So that's their kind of an element of PR. So well, they can submit requests to participate just because they are not banned formally in the traditional where standard understanding of the word ban. Another thing, the party can nominate the person that is a member of the party, and the party that is the person that is not affiliated with the party. Party is to inform TC in writing a day prior to the conference, congress or meeting as to the venue and time of the respective gathering, and the member of the TC is entitled to be present there. In the previous code, it was a duty for the TC member to be present at the gathering. It was removed, but here we should add, if this notification is missing, then it could serve as the ground, since that's the provision that is defined by the rules of procedure of nominating the candidates. This should be the ground to refuse the political party to be registered, and political parties should take this into account to comply. All requirements as to nomination and the procedure of nomination is part of the procedure. If you fail to abide that, then that's the reason, the ground to refuse registration. We have written a notification to the CC, but there is no requirement to notify about that on the website of the party 5 days prior to that. Yeah, there is this provision. It shouldn't be it should not only be notification on the website, if the website is available. That's a requirement. It should be a party website. There is another interesting thing here. The law requires mass media to be notified about this Congress, but doesn't provide how to notify them. And some parties just notify about this on their website. They say, okay, so please, to whom it may concern, including mass media. But everybody who is listening to us at the moment should remember that there is another requirement, namely the procedure of accredited media outlets at this Congress meeting or gathering. This procedure could be phrased in the form of one sentence: please, everybody is welcome, or submit your name, here is an email. But it should be the procedure of accreditation, that should be the title to it, and it should be approved by the statutory authority who is going to organize this conference, meeting, or congress.
But there could be a refusal in registration in reality, but the story is quite complicated here. There is a question about the competencies of the TEC and the decision of the law, because the jurisdiction of the courts does not cover these issues. That's why to say that the candidates could be invalid or illegitimate is difficult, but there will be a lot of problems due to this norm in nomination, and we have to take into account. I did not include this provision because this norm really could be substantiated well, and the failure to inform the CEC could be the grounds for the refusal of registration, but lack of accreditation or lack of the site or notification of the site, it is necessary to prove it somehow. The screenshot could be provided or whatever. So, well, this is quite a complex process to prove, and in the TEC there will be no notice. Either it could be lost during mailing, or but usually they register the copies and they seal it, and they have to issue the notification that this individual has submitted these documents and such quantity and so on and so forth. If political parties are listening to us, please read the procedures of document flow, and please take care of registering this notice, and so that it will be registered in the logs of incoming documentation. As for the nomination, we are going to have the webinar on the electoral systems, and we are going to analyze all these aspects in detail and the particularities of the electoral system. But as for the nomination, we have to say that the party has to nominate the list. The list in the multi-mandate constituency, and it should be not larger than the list of the number of deputies on the list to the Rayon Council. And these candidates which are part of that single electoral list, apart from the first guaranteed number, should be allocated and also have to be nominated in territorial constituencies, and territorial lists should be not less than 5 and not more than 12 candidates. But we have to underscore that this is a mandatory requirement. It is impossible for the local organization to nominate the candidates only in 4 out of 5 territorial constituencies, because the norm reads that in each territorial constituency they have to be nominated. So if there are less, then they are not going to be registered, because this will be considered to be a violation of the procedure of registration and the grounds for refusal. And if we are talking about the multi-mandate majoritarial system, the party is nominating the list of candidates to the relevant council, and there are no requirements as far as this is concerned. The party can nominate the candidate in the relevant multi-mandate constituency or not do it. It's the right of the party, but not the obligation. And while the multi-mandate constituencies are created in the communities with a population up to 10,000 electors, and in each of these constituencies, from 2 to 4 candidates could be elected, and the TEC during during division of the constituencies have already identified what is the magnitude of the constituency, how many candidates are going to be nominated and elected in this constituency, and the organization of the party can offer one candidate or nominate 2, 3, or 4 candidates depending on how many mandates are going to be offered in this constituency. As to the mayor, here I just quoted the norm, which we have already discussed. There is a particularity, and it's the following. This candidate is being approved by the central governing body of the party, as the decision is being sealed by the central organization of the party. Actually, this means a certain system of approval of candidates by the central level, and we have discussed it amply already, and the role is being decreased of the local branches. And when the parties took a decision to participate in the elections, they had to actually identify the people who are going to approve it on the top level. This depends on the statute, and the central governing body of the party has to be responsible for that. Maybe usually the board. It's not necessarily that the Congress should do it, but the board can do it. Because this procedure might be carried out later than the Congress has been convened. The central governing bodies of the parties are not that numerous. There could be several: political council or board or national council. In some of the parties, there are the interim bodies between the Congress and the executive board. There are bodies which actually include the representatives of the regions. But you're absolutely correct in saying that the parties, in accordance with their charter statutes, decide which body this should be done. It's done to their own discretion. The majority of the parties usually use this smaller body to decrease, the difficulties in approving the candidates. Well, there could be some technical errors while the lists are being compiled, and not to make this procedure too bureaucratic to the extent that it will be impossible to quickly change the lists or amend the lists. Or that's why they usually put in charge of these approvals not the Congress, but some executive bodies. Declarations. In general, at the previous local elections, and there is a general norm too, and there was a necessity to provide a declaration, submit the declaration, and I think that the individual has a right to know what are the revenues and assets of the candidate, and it might have an impact on the freedom of elections, and actually it will help to shape up the public opinion as well. And it has been used always as one of the components. It was used by the opponents, and it was used by the candidates if they did not have big assets to be declared. And actually it could have an impact on campaigning, but at present this norm has been deleted, and it is envisaged that after the candidate is elected, has the authority, he becomes a councillor but not the candidate, or becomes a mayor, and then they have to submit the declarations. And there is interpretation of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and I think that this norm was quite, straightforward, that the declaration is not being submitted, and and it has a blanket character, and it coincides with the law of Ukraine of preventing corruption. But nevertheless, this interpretation helped a lot, because in the TECs there were a lot of discussions on this issue, and thus these discussions have been resolved. And I have heard about the discussions not only in TECs, but also among the representatives of the headquarters of the parties. Yes, and a lot of people made a sigh of relief when this was cancelled. And I'd like to emphasize, I believe that it could have been, there should have been a limitation at the level of a village or a settlement. Yes, they were saying that a lot of potential candidates and will have difficulties in doing it because it is necessary to have digital signature. It has to be entered into the register. The register not always operates perfectly well, and so on and so forth. But when we are talking about amalgamated communities, and these councillors are going to use the budget funds and also implement the strategies of development of territorial communities. And, these powers and authorities envisage that these people should have a digital signature, but at least at the level of oblast councils and city councils in oblast centers and city mayors, this norm should have been introduced. In this respect, I have an idea which is not very popular in the expert community. I believe the state cannot and should not create additional hurdles on the way of the implementation of the fundamental right of the individual to participate in the public affairs management. And if the state makes additional obligations about declaration or collecting the documents, they should not do that. As far as declaring the assets is concerned, there is a problem. Including into the group of those who have to declare actually destroys the tools of the National Bureau of Prevention of Corruption. And actually, in spite of the fact that they have a huge toolkit for this, they cannot really analyze the data from these declarations of assets. They do not have mechanisms of electronic databases which will automatically check and verify the declarations. Even the availability of such tools will not resolve the problems. But when we are talking about the local self-government, we have to think about the flexible limitations. For example, an individual submits the declaration if he or she had more than 2 or 3 sources of revenues, or if the revenues exceed certain amounts, like 50,000 hryvnia, million hryvnia, or an individual whose assets are more expensive than a certain amount, or the person who is paying the real estate tax. But my main thesis is the following: any limitations of the freedom of the individual should be proportional to the objective, and even delaying the submission of the declaration until the oath is being taken by the councillor who has been elected is not proportional. But at the level of the communities, I wouldn't say that the small cities next to Kiev should not be declaring their assets. I think that it might be more essential declaring those assets in those villages, but not even at the rayon councils in the west of Ukraine. That's a very interesting question for discussion. Thank you. So maybe we come to the conclusion that we have to think through this tool, this mechanism, and the complete cancellation of the declaration is maybe not appropriate. It's not a linear question or issue which could be resolved in that simple manner. We've mentioned already the references about the absence of criminal record. There is an opportunity to get that reference, and there was a big discussion how it should be drawn, and the CEC gave its interpretation on the 8th of September, and they said that this could be a reference which has been obtained from the site on the basis of the digital signature, and it's a problem quite often to get connected to this site. And this interpretation helped a little bit, but it's we understand the position of CEC, that they take into account the reference which have been issued after the beginning of the electoral process. A lot of candidates, though, we're getting these references at the end of August. So it will be an unexpected decision of the CSC that they will have to obtain this reference after the 5th of September. But this should be a relevant information and actual information, and the code has not spelled out 1 month's term, or there is no other requirements of the CSC, and such reference could be obtained by the individual in accordance with a digital signature, and the political party should not do it for the candidate, so it should be done individually. It's a discussion issue. In principle, as for me, this could be done by the party. If the party is nominating, the party is paying a deposit, so why the party cannot take this reference? Well, because this is not, because the general procedure is not envisaging usage of the general register of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. But actually, it will be simpler for the candidates if the party could have done it. It could have been done it in writing, and the query could be made in writing, and the answer could be got in writing. And in these issues, I believe that we have to exercise a liberal approach. Again, this is a proportionality of the limitations of the candidates. Who needs that? The state needs. The CEC has to make a query, and the code envisages that the commissions are being created by the bodies of the justice, and they can get all the information in the registers. And the Ministry of Interior could have been obligated to give all this information as of the 15th of September or 25th of September, or on the request of the Territorial Commission. So this is sort of an administrative service, and it's based on the principle of application, and the state has to address all the issues between the bodies, between the and itself, but not to create difficulties for the nominees. But as far as I know, this information is being collected automatically through the service centers, but it is being almost manually processed in the ministry. And there is a nuance. The provision envisages 30 days term to provide an answer to this application. So if they are not going to submit this application prior to the 15th or the 24th, the Ministry of Interior is not going to violate the procedure of issuing the reference on the criminal record, and the candidate will lose the right to run. But we can praise the CEC, and this is the case when they really did a good job. This interpretation was made in a very liberal manner. Those who were working with these references, and I had an honor several weeks ago to work there, and there are several kinds of references: complete, incomplete, hard copy, electronic form, and CEC, understanding the norm of the electoral code that this should be a reference, they said any reference in any form. So we should not require, let's say, full reference. It could be, partial reference. So this is one of the unfortunately few examples when the CEC did a good job in this respect. And now we are going to a very important aspect. It's gender quotas. We would like to focus the attention of our audience on it. We talked about it at the previous webinar, but we should repeat it again. And we have the gender quota at last, and it is mentioned not in the general part or section of the law on the political parties or basics of the electoral law, but it has been made part of the procedure for nomination. The situation was quite complex at the elections in 2015 when this quota was established in the right to be nominated.
It was provided to have a 30% of gender quota then, and Kyiv Court of Appeal, both chambers made two conflicting opposite decisions, one for the existence of the quota in its support, the other decision against it. So in one case, the decision of the CC was revoked, in the other it was upheld. High Administrative Court, the highest in the system of administrative courts, supported the CC and found that since lack of a gender quota was not stipulated as the reason for rejecting registration, then this could not serve as the ground in this decision. So that's really kind of, position that can be discussed or contested, but that what it was said then. Gender quota at the multi-mandate constituency is a must. 30% for the community of Southern, when we are talking about the TCs. So you can nominate in one constituency, you can do that in many. So that's a kind of discretion that the party enjoys. So there is some room for maneuver, in other words, and it is quite broad. As to proportionate system, so the room for maneuver is really limited. As we said, when it comes to nomination and registration, especially because of whether that's one list or a territorial list, in every 5 members there should be at least 2 candidates from the other sex, and if there are 6 candidates, we are saying 5 to 12. If there are 6, then one person should be female, the other is male. So they should go. So every other should be of a different gender. So if you have 7 candidates, for instance, so we have 5 with 2 persons of the other gender. 6 numbers should be, if it is male, then 7 should be female. If the number of candidates is 6, then the code does not govern this instance, and it is left to the discretion of the party who would be candidate under number 6. If the party didn't have any desire to violate this provision, but they got confused and they did not abide about this, every other candidate to be of the opposite gender. Would it be a violation? Yes, because that's a requirement to the procedure of nomination. So from my perspective, so that's going to be found as a violation. Do you talk to political parties about this? They are going to nominate their candidates. What do they think about that? Do they understand all these nuances? Not always. Some local organizations are really hostile to this particular provision. Why? Due to a necessity of searching for candidates. They believe that it is a difficult scene, that's a complexity, that's a burden for them, and that's just mainly linked to the fact that local party organizations are sometimes or are normally not that developed, and when it comes to nomination and registration, all that is happening under control of the central party organization or headquarter. So they don't engage women at the local level into the party work. They don't have people with disabilities working at the local level. So party organizations should take into account the diversity from the very outset of developing its party structure. Then they wouldn't have any problems with meeting quarters. Question to Volodymyr. You said that you are of liberal opinions as to restrictions. What about this particular requirement? What do you think about that? Isn't it too severe when it comes to nomination? A difficult question. When you talk about local self-government and the fundamental level, so the issue there is not about women that is normally discussed when you talk about quotas, but the question is different. I have seen one interesting survey about the proportion of the or representation of different gender at local level prior to 2015 and since 2015. So until 2015, the existence of local mandate allowed to delay serving in the army. That's why a lot of young men made use of that to avoid joining armed forces. With the beginning of war and all the events that started in 2014, this provision was withdrawn. And in 2015, we saw well, I'm talking about the communities with no resources or little resources. We saw a dramatic decrease of men working at local level. So the issue at local level, if you wish, is the issue of finding sufficient number of men willing to work there. Electoral quotas shouldn't be permanent, though. They shouldn't be the only incentive to secure gender equality. If it is an artificial measure, then either at the beginning or at some point anyways, they will be taken hostile. And unless other tools are going to be proposed by the state, then they would stop working. That's the same as asset declarations. A lot of people don't want to run because they don't want to submit their asset declarations. They face criminal liability if they misstate or provide inaccurate information, or if they realize that apart from just being a councillor, if they are elected, they can always be invited for an interview, as it is called, to an investigator. They can be charged, etc. So people are not willing to run just to avoid all these complexities. There is another thing here, so a classical issue. What shall we do if we have low-quality type of candidates or improper documents at the registration stage? Local party organization submits the list with delicate balance. They almost meet it. I mean, they almost meet requirement. Or, for instance, if this turn of gender is violated, if it is a female candidate that submits documents that are not properly done. For instance, this statement. So the CEC liberalized requirements as to the consent to run, but there is no template there for the first person on the list. Others have additional requirement to submit their consent to run, not only in multi-mandate constituency, but the number of the constituencies should be stated, though the code doesn't require that, and that's a restriction to the parties, because the party can nominate the person in the constituency where they want to. And the person says, you know what, I want to run at this particular constituency. So if we use this example, there is a mistake in the statement where the consent, the picture is of a different size, and two candidates are removed from the list submitted, then gender balance changes. And in this slide, we see the result. The TC refuses registration of the entire list of the candidates. Is it a proportionate response? Well, it seems that you are teaching bad things to the audience. No, you know what? I'm going to say that. Well, but you know that's the practice that we might face. I think we should say that it's just potential mistakes, inaccuracies, and the ground for refusal in registration is clearly stated. It looks clear, but we'll see how it's going to look in practice. We have a typical situation for local elections and for national elections when the resume does not have any line about the geotype of work, that's considered to be deficiency. We spoke about that with the representative of the CEC, namely, allegedly there is a European court case law, that's Skuratov versus Russia, where the excessive formalism is deemed to be violation, and the Supreme Court case law also proves, and it is kind of established practice that proves that it is true. So, if comma is missing, if document is missing, so that an excessive requirement. But if the candidate does not contest that, not everybody is going to contest it. Those candidates who would contest it, they received court ruling as to excessive formalism, but there were lots of candidates that got refusals and didn't contest that. That's one of the new things that was introduced by the Law 3438 this summer. Article 230 was complemented by other norms. They were softer versus the ones that were offered. But anyways, they provide for the following. Lack of stating of mandatory information provided for by the code means that the information is missing. The softening was made by the following. The TSC should request the candidate to correct it, and if, I think it's 2 days, if in the course of 2 days the candidate does not remedy the flaw, then a lack of information would mean lack of a document that serves as the ground to reject registration. So that's one of the bad ideas that turn electoral process into the process that should follow every step in a very monitored and guided manner. It's good that you referred to the European court case law. The only thing I would like to see how it is on the level of village, town, or city council, when playing into the hands of a stronger candidate, they want to potentially get rid of a weaker one. I would like to see how the TEC would respond to the references to the European court case law. Well, it seems to me that all TECs are within the discretion of the district courts. So that's district courts that they will have to deal with. So 5 days to notify. So the time frame is so short that the party could have only 2 conferences. So one option to correct mistakes, and those who plan the conferences to be held on 2021st wouldn't have any time to correct any mistakes. We spoke about the time frame of the electoral process, how tight it is. At the previous webinars, we said that the quite complex campaign would require additional discussions to amend electoral code. At the moment we go through the organizational stage and we identify a lot of different provisions that could be potentially problematic. What you said, Volodymyr, I didn't know about this, but that's the practice that is not in line with the convention, and basically that's part of the legislation. So it was softened a little bit. It was supposed to be even harsh, but thanks to Olga's efforts, it was a little bit softened. It was last-minute amendment, thanks to Kalchenko's amendment. It was phrased differently, though. Given three different parts that could be interpreted differently, the Commission could refer to this particular part rather than the one that speaks that it is deficiency that anyway is required to restore the substance of the document. So if they pursue formalistic approach, and it is quite popular, then it might happen. We need to take into account that the most progressive court, the most progressive judge, with the best arguments of the lawyer, you have to remember that you need to meet deadlines, because we have Molchenko versus Ukraine judgment where European court found that there was a violation, the rights to be protected, but it was too late. So effective legal remedy of the violated right is missing. So my personal recommendation, if somebody wants to run, not to wait until the 20th. You have to do that 19th the latest to leave some room for maneuver, because 5 days for the Commission to make decision on registration, that's the time when you can exercise your passive voting right in an efficient manner. Out of the information that we have in media, we can figure out that people are going to wait until the last day just to campaigning. Campaigning is for the next webinar. Olga, there is another legal issue which is important. It says that TC makes the decision to refuse to register the list of the candidates. If they did register the list and at a later stage it was found that there was a violation, does that mean that gender representation, if it is missing, could it serve the ground for revoking registration? Well, there is a provision that there are some other grounds that shouldn't lead to registration. Let me phrase it this way. I don't have a clear wording, but we wanted to attract attention to all the subjects who want to run, to say that 2020 campaign takes serious account of gender issues, especially given all the things that Volodymyr outlined, and you shouldn't wait until the last day to submit the documents. That's very important too. That's just very good advice to all of you. Deposit, that's another scene. When amendments were made, one of the most discussable provisions, and that was the first time ever when deposit was introduced for self-nominees at the level of town and village. It has never been there before, and at least our organization, we always stress that we believe that it is not proportionate. It is an unproportionate obstacle that hinders nomination of the candidates, and especially this grassroots level, the deposit shouldn't be imposed. On the one hand, it was said that deposit is allegedly small, but if you look at the numbers, 20% of the minimum salary, and party should deposit the sum of money for each of the candidates, and if it is 11,000 people residing in certain place, and there we have 0.22 kopecks per voter. Then in a village you have to pay a larger deposit than in a town or in a larger village that cross this boundary. Do you have any experience in other countries of similar types of formula? Well, this formula has always been applied, but the question here is the deposit for the settlements with the population over 10,000 with proportionate system. It should be larger there, it should be higher there, but they managed to convince MPs to decrease the deposit there, and when it comes to the other settlements, it was left untouched.
And I think there were different numbers previously. Yes, in the first version of the electoral code, it was different. As a member of the working group, I still cannot understand at which meeting of the working group this approach was agreed. And whereas the minutes, we were trying to find the minutes of that meeting, and where we were discussing it, we failed to find the minutes. But there was the deposit at the elections of the mayor of the city, which was twice as big as the deposit during the elections of the mayor of London. But the positive side of it is the fact that it has been decreased, but the negative aspect is that this deposit has been introduced in the settlements and the villages with the number of voters under 10,000. The formula is here. Yesterday, the CEC defined and counted these deposits for each settlement, and they have published it on the site. One can find this decision of the CEC and to be governed by it. But one of the problems and issues which has been mentioned here, what should be done, and how this deposit should be paid. And there is an interpretation of the CEC, but there is also a norm of the electoral code. It should be done as one sum payment and it has to be remitted in non-pecuniary form. So there are the branches of the party which have nominated the candidate, and they have to make this deposit. But it should not be done by the central office of the party, central organization of the party. We have the case law as far as this aspect is concerned. For the physical person, the deposit is being provided by a different physical person, and it's not been remitted, but it's done in cash, and this is considered to be an invalid deposit, and there are no differences in the case law in this respect. And everybody has to pay attention to this aspect. And actually, in 2015, the lists have not been registered from the parties because the deposit was not properly paid. And that's why the parties have to be very responsible in terms of paying this deposit. So, generally, these are all the issues we wanted to raise. And on this optimistic note, we can, complete our discussion today. Today, we have exhausted the main agenda of this event, and I'd like to thank very much our experts. Vladimir Wenger was the PhD in law and the docent of the chair of the General Law and Public Law of Kyiv Mohyla Academy University, and Olga Kutsukuba, the chief advisor on legal issues of Opora Civil Network. And the series of webinars is going to be continued next week, and this series of webinars has been organized by the project of support of transparency, inclusiveness and fairness of electoral practices in Ukraine, of the Council of Europe and the Platform of Human Rights in Ukraine. And please follow